And the first thing that really rocked my world was the murder of Oscar Romero in El Salvador in 1980. Which happened, of course, under Jimmy Carter. And I say that because sometimes people misremember it as happening under Reagan. But it was in 1980, and Jimmy Carter was president. Oscar Romero, the Archbishop of San Salvador, who's now a saint, right? As of October of 2018, we can call him Saint Oscar Romero. He was murdered a month after he sent a letter to Jimmy Carter asking him to stop funding the military of El Salvador. Jimmy Carter never responded to that letter, and he was murdered a month later by U.S.-backed forces, as we know. Yes?
He was shot by a sniper while he was holding up the Blessed Sacrament of the Holy Eucharist.
During Mass, absolutely. And this event shocked me. I actually learned about it. I used to watch, as a kid, I was 12 years old at the time, and I used to watch 60 Minutes every Sunday. My family would be downstairs watching Disney, and I'd go up to my parents' bedroom and on their little black and white TV watch 60 Minutes. And they had Dan Rather talking about the murder of Romero, and that it looked like, at that time, of course, it wasn't definitive who killed him, but Rather pointed out that it looked like it very well could be the forces the U.S. was supporting there, and this blew my mind. Because, of course, I was raised to believe that my country was protecting the church from the godless Reds, right? The threat to the church came from the communists, I was told, who, if they won, if they succeeded in taking over the world, as I learned they were supposed to do or wanted to do, they would destroy the church. And of course, for the first time, I started to realize, and I would realize more as the years went by, that it was quite the opposite, that it was the United States that was destroying the church, particularly in Latin America. And this is what really brought me to the progressive movement and to the peace movement. Of course, in 1989, about a week after the fall of the Berlin Wall, 6 Jesuit priests in El Salvador were murdered, also by U.S.-backed forces, which was pretty much the crescendo of the war in El Salvador and really the end of the Cold War as well. In any case, so I went to Nicaragua in the fall of 1987, lived there for a month in Ocotal on the border of Honduras. And again, and I went really kind of as an agnostic in terms of the situation. I was very confused about what was happening in Nicaragua, because I was being told on the one hand by the mainstream press that the Contras were these freedom fighters, fighting for democracy, and of course I was reading the left-wing press like The Nation and others that were saying no, that the Sandinistas were the democratic forces, And what occurred to me, of course, and if you go to Nicaragua, and if you've been, especially back then, just the poverty that people lived in. I mean, these little villages where kids were running around in literally rags and without shoes, and realizing that my country, the most powerful nation on earth, was fighting a war against these people. And really, I never looked back after that. And as I said, within a few months, I was, for the first time, engaged in civil disobedience with someone named Kathy Kelly, who I didn't even know who she was. I took the train downtown. I lived in Wheeling, a little suburb of Chicago. Took the train downtown and went to Water Tower Place in Chicago and sang political Christmas carols in Water Tower Place, which was kind of like the gallery here. And I remember one line, at least of one of them, and it went, away in El Salvador, death squads abound. And anyway, there was about 10 of us there, including Kathleen. So we spent the evening in jail that night. And when I came home, my parents told me they didn't want me to ever come home again. because I was 1920, because I'd been arrested a couple days before Christmas, and of course, how would Christ feel? How would baby Jesus feel about this? In any case, that's my first encounter with Kathy Kelly, and I've been a big fan of hers ever since, and I hope that I can fill her shoes, or at least come close to it. So let me talk, though, a little bit about the Middle East, because I know that's what Kathy was going to talk about. I know she's been in Afghanistan many times and just got back from there. We are now, of course, into about the 19th year of the war in Afghanistan. The longest war the U.S. has ever had. I mean, one of the longest conflicts in modern memory of any kind, 19 years. And let's just remember something, because of course we live in the land of amnesia. Right? We forget what happened yesterday, much as what happened a long time ago. Let's remember how we got here. We are fighting, if you recall, and all of you recall, 1980, the U.S. boycotted the Olympics because the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. We are fighting the exact same war that the Soviet Union was fighting then. And the same people, right? And why? Because the U.S., by the way, 6 months before the Soviets invaded, we know this because Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor of Carter, would later admit this, the U.S. began arming the Mujahideen 6 months before the Soviets invaded. A lot of people, of course, remember, because we were told by the media, we were arming the Mujahideen because the Soviets invaded. But that's not the case. Brzezinski's plan was to fund the Mujahideen, these radical religious zealots, including Osama bin Laden, in Afghanistan, in order to draw the Soviets into Afghanistan. At the time that we began supporting the Mujahideen, who would later morph into the Taliban, the very people we're fighting now, there was a secular socialist government in Afghanistan, where women had rights. You know, there was those famous pictures of women walking with books with mini skirts down the street. And it was the U.S. that broke the peace by arming the Mujahideen. Of course, we don't find out for years later how that war began. And fascinatingly, of course, I was just listening to NPR last week, and I listen to NPR every day pretty much, as a horrible, bad habit, because it really usually upsets me, their international coverage especially. And they were interviewing a woman from Afghanistan who was saying, oh, if the Taliban come back to power, if the U.S. leaves and the Taliban comes back to power, of course, they will repress women and women's rights will be hurt, which there's no doubt that that's true. But we have to remember that it was the U.S. in arming the Mujahideen in 1979 that took us down this road, where religious zealots took over Afghanistan, and will again. It's inevitable that the Taliban will be back in power. But it's one of the most incredible historic facts that we forget about, that we were the ones that helped bring the Mujahideen to power, and now we're fighting them. 19 years later, with no end in sight, and you saw just this week the U.S. bombed by accident and killed 30 pine nut growers. You know, we hit more weddings and more civilians in Afghanistan than we do combatants. And again, it's something we don't hear a lot about. So, obviously, trying to get us out of the war in Afghanistan has got to be one of the top priorities of the peace movement. Meanwhile, of course, a new war is looming with Iran. We could be at war with Iran soon. And there are people, yes?
Are you listening to Tulsi Gabbard?
Of course. I love Tulsi Gabbard. Yesterday, if you saw me, I was wearing my Tulsi 2020 t-shirt. And I want to talk about, I actually wrote a book on Iran last year, and I was in Iran in 2017, so I want to focus a lot on Iran. First of all, while I said I really did misspeak, as I said, we could be at war with Iran soon. The truth is we are at war with Iran. War by other means, right? As Trump vowed in May of this year, the U.S. is attempting to, quote, bring Iran's oil exports to zero, unquote. This is obviously the lifeblood of Iran's economy. And we have sanctioned Iran to the hilt, to the point that they have difficulty importing food and importing medicines. And people are dying in Iran because of these sanctions. That is war. As we know, for example, from Iraq, the sanctions of the 90s killed 1 million Iraqis, 500,000 of whom were children. And of course, we all remember Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State, being asked, was it worth it? 500,000 children dying in Iraq. And she said yes. And now, of course, she goes around the country showing her buttons. Apparently she has a button collection, and that's what people, want to see her buttons. A person who thinks 500,000 children is collateral damage. And so, we are trying to starve out Iran, as we are Venezuela as well, of course. In addition, the U.S. has been backing the MEK group, a terrorist group. In fact, it was a designated terrorist group until 2012, until Obama took them off the terrorist list. They've killed 17,000 people within Iran. And very prominent U.S. politicos have addressed their conferences. For example, John Bolton and Howard Dean. They are now considered our friends. And what they would like to do, of course, is restore the Shah to the throne. The Shah's son lives in Paris. And they would like to bring him, restore the monarchy to Iran. That's our idea, of course, of democracy. And the State Department has been trying to pave the way for the return of the monarchy for some time. And of course, that begs the question about the nature of the Shah to begin with. And so I'll just remind folks, again, because we do live in a country that forgets so much, that the first CIA operation of regime change was in Iran, beginning in 1951 to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh, the Prime Minister of Iran. He was democratically elected. They had a democratic parliament known as the Majlis. And at the time that Mossadegh was elected, Iran's oil was being controlled by the British, by the Anglo-Persian oil company, which would become British Petroleum. And all the profits from Iran's oil were going out the door to Britain. Meanwhile, 90% of Iranians lived in abject poverty. And so shockingly, when they had a Democratic prime minister, he wanted to do something about this. And he nationalized the oil, as we know. Wanted to use Iran's oil for the Iranians, just as Chavez did in Venezuela, nationalizing the oil for the Venezuelans. But this, of course, is unacceptable. And the British, who were the ones who lost out at that moment, they may have wanted a coup and failed and then were thrown out of the country by Iran. And so Britain came to their big Uncle Sam and asked for help to overthrow Mossadegh. By the way, it's kind of curious. Originally, Britain came to President Truman, who was president at the time, for help to do this, and his response was, I don't care about British oil interest in Iran. I'm not sending troops for that, or going to overthrow a government for your oil. You can go pound salt. So there was a change in government in both the UK and the United States, in which Churchill became prime minister again, and Eisenhower became president here. And so Churchill made another run at the U.S. through Eisenhower, and with the help of the Dulles brothers, you might remember John and Allen Dulles, Secretary of State and head of the CIA respectively, both of which had interests in Anglo-Persian oil. They convinced Eisenhower that Iran somehow and Mossadegh were a communist threat. And this led Eisenhower to greenlight the coup against Mossadegh. And so through tactics that we see today, again, countries like Venezuela, Nicaragua, Bolivia right now, the U.S. paid violent gangs to riot in the streets. Of course, they had enforced an entire embargo against Iranian oil, where they literally did cut Iran's oil exports to zero at that time. And they effectively overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh and reinstalled the Shah. By the way, so the Shah was reinstalled as the head monarch, but they did replace Mossadegh with another prime minister, with a guy named General Zahedi. And he was picked to lead the coup and become the new prime minister. Why? Because he had the best anti-communist bona fides anyone could have. He collaborated with the Nazis during World War II. So this, in the CIA's view, made him 100% reliable. And so he became the new prime minister of Iran. In any case, as we know, the CIA helped keep the Shah, horribly unpopular Shah, in power through something called the Savak, which they would set up in 1957 and train the Savak, the Iranian security forces, in Nazi torture techniques. And the Savak would rule Iran with an iron hand until the revolution of 1979. In 1978, the year before the Islamic Revolution in Iran, Amnesty International declared that Iran had the very worst human rights on earth. And that was, again, U.S. democracy, as far as they were concerned. And as we know, the Shah was overthrown by the Islamic Revolution in 1979, and we have not forgiven Iran since. Just like we haven't forgiven Nicaragua for overthrowing Somoza in the very same year. And by the way, it's very interesting to point out, again, when we look at the nature of the Middle East today, and we sometimes wring our hands, where are all these secular governments that used to exist there? Why is there this extreme religious radicalism coming from there? It's because of U.S. policies which destroyed every secular government that was there. And so, not only did the U.S. overthrow a democratic government in Iran, not only did it support a monarchy until 1979, but it guaranteed that the nature of the revolution that followed in 1979 was an Islamic revolution. And how? Because the mosques were the only place in Iran that were safe enough to organize in, because of the severe repression of the Shah and the Savak. And so we guaranteed that there would be a revolution eventually in Iran, and that it would be an Islamic one. And now, of course, we wring our hands about the nature of the government in Iran. But let me say a few things about the Iranian government, about Iran, that I think we need to keep in mind. First of all, let's remember that between 1980 and 1988, the U.S. supported Saddam Hussein's war against Iran. Supported the invasion of Iran and the 8-year war that followed, arming Saddam and providing him, as we know from a 1994 congressional investigation, providing him with the chemicals that he used to attack Iran and his own Kurdish population. And the U.S. provided Saddam with the logistical support, the targeting of those chemical weapons. Meanwhile, Iran never responded in kind. And why? Because the Ayatollah Khomeini, the greatly despised Ayatollah Khomeini, issued a fatwa saying the use of chemical weapons is against the law of Islam. And so Iran just took it in terms of the chemical weapons, which killed tens of thousands of Iranians. Of course, let's not forget that during the same time, the U.S. also began arming Iran. We were arming both sides of the conflict for two reasons. Of course, one, because we were selling arms to Iran in order to get cash for the Contras in Nicaragua, right? The Iran-Contra scandal, because Congress had twice cut off aid because of the human rights violations of the Contras. But the other reason, which was very conscious of U.S. policymakers, was they also didn't want Iraq becoming too strong either. So they wanted to arm both sides so that they would go at each other and weaken each other at a cost of 1 million total lives on both sides of the Iran-Iraq border. That is, of course, a war that is not forgotten in Iran. But notwithstanding that, again, you often hear, of course, that Iran is a terrorist state. That's what we're saying. That's the big claim right now for why we have to stop Iran. Well, let's remember, of course, that Iran did not attack us on 9/11. In fact, what was it, 15 of the 19 attackers were from Saudi Arabia, our good friend, who promotes Wahhabism, the philosophy that has given rise to groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. What was Iran's response to 9/11? They contacted George W. Bush and said, "We're sorry that happened and we want to help you in the war on terror." And they provided help in the war on terror. They helped the U.S. in its operations against the Taliban in Afghanistan. And they helped arrest Al-Qaeda leaders. Because Iran hates Al-Qaeda. They are mortal enemies. And the U.S. recognized at this time that Iran provided this help on the war on terror. And at this time, the Iranians, who had always wanted a better relationship with the U.S., because the Iranians, notwithstanding how badly we've abused them over the years, and notwithstanding some of the more vitriolic rhetoric that comes out of Iran, the Iranians love Americans. And they love America. And if you go to Iran, which I did in 2017, you'll witness this. When people find out you're an American, they love you. They'll speak English to you. Most people do speak English there. And they want a photo taken by you. They don't bear ill will towards us, for the most part. So Iran thought, hey, we helped you in the war on terror. Maybe we can be friends now. So the Iranian government sent a fax to Washington setting forth a proposal for a grand bargain in which all of the U.S.'s concerns with Iran would be up for grabs, including its support for Hezbollah and other things. The U.S. never responded to that fax. Instead, you'll remember, George W. Bush would make his famous axis of evil speech, claiming that Iran was somehow part of an axis of evil with its mortal enemy Iraq and North Korea. And that was the end of that chance for peace at that time. Meanwhile, in places like Iraq and Syria, a number of, you'll see at least once in a while, even in the mainstream press, it being recognized that Iran has been critical in fighting ISIS in those places. They were critical in getting ISIS out of Iraq after the U.S. invasion, which helped give rise to ISIS. Iran is not our enemy. Objectively speaking, they're more of a potential friend and ally than Saudi Arabia is, who has been supporting groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, as we know. And as the U.S. has, let's face it, in places like Syria. In fact, as early as 2006, 2007, Seymour Hersh wrote an article in the New Yorker called The Redirection, in which he exposed that as early as that time, the mid-2000s, the U.S. was already beginning to work with extremist groups in Syria. And he predicted that there would be this backlash and a rise of something like ISIS. That was the name at the time, but that he predicted that. Of course, how was Seymour Hersh, the Pulitzer Prize Award winner, awarded for such prescience? He can't get published in this country anymore. He lost his job at the New Yorker. He moved to the London Review of Books, and then he ultimately moved even farther to some German publication that I had never even heard of. So, speaking those types of truths is not a way to get ahead, of course, in this country. Meanwhile, I think we need to face the facts that I think a lot of us know, but it's important to point out, that as Martin Luther King said years ago, the U.S. is still the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And in fact, there were two recent international polls taken of 60,000 people in 60 different countries. In both polls, the number one ranking country by far, ranked as the greatest threat to world peace, was the United States, with 25% of respondents saying the U.S. was the greatest threat to world peace. And as an objective matter, it is true. In fact, if you look at the Middle East, we have been laying waste to that region. In fact, I just want to read, this is a book I wrote on Iran. I want to read a quote.
What's the title of the book?
Oh, The Plot to Attack Iran. And this is a quote I have in it from Noam Chomsky about the U.S. invasion in 2003 of Iraq. He says the following: Pentagon officials in charge did make sure that other sites were protected, the oil and security ministries. Elsewhere, looting and destruction, including the irreplaceable treasures of civilization, proceeded unconstrained. 2 years after the invasion, the president of the American Academic Research Institute in Iraq, McGuire Gibson, sadly confirmed that, quote, Iraq is losing its culture and its wealth, unquote. By then, more than half of the nation's archaeological sites, including most major Sumerian ones, have been destroyed. The Americans are not doing anything, Gibson added. The losses at these sites dwarfed even the massive looting of the National Museum shortly after the U.S. troops arrived, in which at least 15,000 to 20,000 looted pieces disappeared, probably forever. And this is being replayed, of course, in places like Syria and Libya. And it will happen in Iran if the U.S. invades that country. By the way, I will note some of the antiquities did get back to Iraq because they were discovered, of course, where in the possession of Hobby Lobby. The Hobby Lobby company ended up with a number of those antiquities. Yeah, true story. So let me talk a little bit too at what is at stake in Iran. I mean, if you go to Iran, it's overwhelming the amount of history that is there. Iran is one of the few countries in the Middle East that has existed as a state, as a unified country, for thousands of years. Most of the countries in the Middle East, as you know, have been carved up and created by the colonial powers. Iran is one exception. And so you go to Iran and you see ancient Zoroastrian ruins, which are incredible. And amazing mosques, of course, but also Armenian Christian churches, which are still active. And Jewish synagogues. Do you know that Iran has the second largest Jewish population in the Middle East outside Israel? 25,000 Jews live there. There is a Jewish hospital in in Tehran, that the government has given millions of dollars to. And despite Israel's attempt to bribe people, to give people thousands of dollars to leave Iran and move to Israel, the Jewish population is staying. They want to be there. And by the way, again, the monstrous Ayatollah Khomeini, shortly after the Iranian Revolution, issued a fatwa ordering the Iranian people to protect Jews within Iran. But all this history and all these antiquities and all this culture will be lost if a military invasion happens of that country. According to retired Lieutenant Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, you may remember him, he wrote the Yellow Cake speech for Colin Powell, which helped lead us into the war in Iraq. And he is now regretful of this. He said, I helped lie us into one war, I'm not going to do it again. He's out proselytizing, saying we cannot invade Iran. He estimates that a war with Iran will be 10 times more costly in lives and treasure than the war in Iraq.
Saudi Arabia wants to prostitute us into this war.
Well, Saudi Arabia, I think Israel's interested. Yeah. In any case, we have a lot of work on our hands. And I think it's important to note too, we have an election coming up, of course, and people get very distracted with that. We have to remind ourselves that the things that a lot of us want and that we're going to be voting about and supporting candidates about, like Medicare for all and debt relief for students and infrastructure investment, none of those things are possible if we continue to spend trillions of dollars on war. This country doesn't build anymore. It destroys. And we need to change that fact. We need to change the nature of our own country. And again, you see the quote by Martin Luther King there. It's completely apt about losing our soul when we spend more money on arms than on our own people. And I fear that our soul is already greatly compromised. We have 800 military bases around the world, at least. We are the largest empire that the world has ever seen. The Romans had 33 military bases. Great Britain had 36. We have over 800. We use more oil. The U.S. military uses more oil than 175 other nations combined. So if you care about social spending, if you care about the environment, and of course if you care about peace and our own existence, ending the war machine has to be our top priority. And that's why I'm so happy to see all of you here today, because I know that you know that and are committed to that. But we also have to make sure that we convince other people of this, especially young people in this country. Thank you very much.